Imagine an empire so vast that its borders stretched from the rainy hills of northern England to the scorching deserts of Egypt, an empire that gave the world law, language, roads, and concrete, an empire so powerful that it seemed eternal. Its capital was called the Eternal City. Now, imagine that one day that empire was gone, vanished from the map of Western Europe. For nearly 1,500 years, we have been asking the same question: why? How did the greatest superpower the ancient world had ever seen simply fall? Was it a single catastrophic event? A mad emperor? An invasion of savage barbarians? The truth is far more fascinating and far more terrifying. It wasn't a simple murder. It was a perfect storm, a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. It involved climate change, deadly viruses, economic collapse, and political corruption so deep that the system basically rotted from the inside out. And here is the scary part. When you look closely at the fall of Rome, you start to see patterns that feel eerily familiar today. I'm your name, and in this video, we aren't just going to scratch the surface. We are going to dig deep into the ultimate mystery of history. Why did the Roman Empire fall? Before we start pulling apart the corpse, we need to be clear about what died. When we say the Roman Empire fell, we are specifically talking about the Western Roman Empire. Because on the other side of the map, the eastern half, known as the Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, continued to thrive for another 1,000 years. So what's the official date of death? Most history books point to September 4th, 476 AD. On that day, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer staged a coup, deposed a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, and declared himself king of Italy. He kindly sent the imperial crown back to Constantinople, basically saying, "We don't need one of these anymore." But here's the catch. Romulus wasn't a great emperor. He was a child, ironically named after the founder of Rome and the first emperor, Augustus. By the time he took the throne, his empire was really just Italy. The provinces of Gaul, Spain, and Britain had already been lost to various barbarian groups. So 476 AD is just the date we put on the tombstone. The sickness that killed the patient had been brewing for over 300 years. To understand the fall, we have to look at the rot that set in long before the barbarians were at the gate. Let's start with the foundation, the government itself. For a long time, Rome was actually well governed, but success created a monster. The empire got too big. By the year 200 AD, Rome was a nightmare to manage. It relied on a system where the emperor was everything. And the problem with having one man in charge is that if he is weak, the whole system is weak. This came to a head in something historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 AD. In the span of just 50 years, Rome had over 20 different emperors, and most of them didn't die of old age. How did emperors die? Usually by their own hands, or rather by the hands of their own bodyguards. The Praetorian Guard, the unit sworn to protect the emperor, realized they had the ultimate power. If they didn't like an emperor, they killed him. If they wanted more money, they killed the emperor and auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder. Imagine the Secret Service deciding to murder the president to see who could pay them the most money. That was Rome in the 3rd century. This instability wasn't just a palace drama, it trickled down. When emperors were constantly fighting for their lives, they couldn't focus on the borders. They couldn't focus on the economy. They ruled through fear and bribery, emptying the treasury to pay soldiers to stay loyal. This led to a phenomenon called military anarchy. The army stopped being loyal to Rome and started being loyal to its generals. If your general paid better than the emperor, you followed your general. This created endless civil wars. In fact, some historians argue that Rome wasn't killed by outsiders. It exhausted itself by constantly fighting itself. By the time Diocletian took power in the late 3rd century, the empire was so ungovernable that he made a drastic decision. He split it in two. the East and the West. This was meant to make communication and defense easier, but in the long run, it created a rich, powerful East and a poor, vulnerable West that slowly drifted apart and stopped helping each other. So, the government is unstable, but what really kills an empire is money or the lack of it. And Rome's economy was a ticking time bomb. The Roman economy was built on two things: conquest and slavery. For centuries, Rome expanded, conquered new lands, stole all their gold and silver, and brought the people back to Italy as slaves to work the farms and mines. It was a hellish system, but it worked. But here is the fatal flaw. Rome stopped expanding. By the 2nd century AD, Emperor Hadrian stopped trying to conquer new lands. He built a wall in Britain. He drew a line in the sand. When the conquest stopped, the flow of gold and new slaves stopped with it. Now, Rome had a massive problem. The empire still needed money to pay for the army and the roads and the grain dole, but without new treasure coming in, they had to get it from the people they already ruled. They raised taxes. And remember those huge farms run by slaves? With the slave supply drying up, the cost of farming skyrocketed. Wealthy landowners started to kick tenant farmers off the land because they couldn't afford to pay them, but they couldn't just leave the land empty. So they created a new system. They told the farmers, "You can stay, but you're not free to leave. You are tied to this land." This was the beginning of serfdom, the system that would later become medieval feudalism. Meanwhile, the government, desperate for cash, did what desperate governments always do. They debased the currency. Emperors started mixing cheaper metals like copper into the silver coins. A coin that used to be pure silver was now mostly junk. This caused massive inflation. Prices went through the roof. People lost faith in money. To fight inflation, Diocletian tried to impose price controls, decreeing that a loaf of bread could only cost a certain amount. But economics doesn't care about decrees. Goods vanished from markets because sellers couldn't make a profit. The economy started to move away from money and back to bartering. To add insult to injury, the trade routes became dangerous. When the Vandals took over North Africa, they became pirates. They cut off Rome's grain supply. Rome, a city of 1 million people, suddenly couldn't feed itself. The economic foundation of Rome crumbled, and the superstructure began to topple. With no money, you can't pay the army. With no army, you can't defend the borders. This is the simplest equation of the fall. The Roman legions, once the most disciplined fighting force in history, were a shadow of their former selves. Because Roman citizens didn't want to join a poorly paid, dangerous army anymore, the empire started hiring foreigners, or barbarians, to fight for them. This is called barbarization. At first, it worked fine. You had tough Germanic warriors fighting for Rome. But eventually, the barbarians realized something. We are the ones with the swords. Why are we taking orders from these soft Romans? The Roman army became a mercenary force, and mercenaries are only loyal until someone else offers more money. In fact, the man who deposed the last emperor, Odoacer, was himself a barbarian general in the Roman army. But the military defeats were catastrophic even before 476. The most significant turning point was the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. Here's the backstory. A fierce group of nomadic warriors from the steppes of Asia, the Huns, began migrating west, pushing Germanic tribes like the Goths before them. These Goths showed up at the Danube River, begging the Roman Emperor Valens to let them settle inside the empire. They were desperate. They promised to be peaceful farmers and soldiers. Rome let them in, but then treated them horribly. Roman officials exploited the starving Goths, forcing them to trade their children into slavery for dog meat. Naturally, the Goths revolted. Emperor Valens marched east with his army to crush them. At Adrianople, the two forces met. The Romans were overconfident. They attacked before reinforcements arrived, marching for hours in the blazing sun. The Gothic cavalry smashed into them. The result? 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army was wiped out. Emperor Valens himself was killed, and his body never found. It was the worst Roman defeat since Hannibal crushed them 600 years prior. Before Adrianople, the Romans always won the big battles. After Adrianople, the psychological advantage was gone. The barbarians knew Rome could bleed. Adrianople was a wake-up call, but the real nightmare began in the winter of 406 AD. The Rhine River, one of Rome's main natural borders, froze solid. Thousands of tribes, Vandals, Alans, Suebi, crossed the ice into Gaul, modern France. They weren't just raiding, they were coming to stay. Why the sudden movement? It goes back to the Huns. The Huns were the ultimate push factor. They were a terrifying enemy. Roman writers described them as monstrous and fierce. They rode small horses and could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from a full gallop. The arrival of the Huns destabilized the entire European continent. Think of it like a set of dominoes. The Huns pushed the Goths pushed the Vandals pushed the Franks. Everyone was moving west, crashing into Roman borders like a tidal wave. In 410 AD, something happened that hadn't happened in 800 years. The city of Rome was sacked. Alaric the Visigoth led his men into the Eternal City. While the looting was relatively tame compared to later sacks, the shock was immeasurable. St. Jerome, a monk living in Bethlehem at the time, wrote, "My voice sticks in my throat, sobs stifle me. The city which had taken the whole world is itself taken." Then in 455 AD, the Vandals came. They did a much more thorough job of destruction, so thorough that their name became a verb, to vandalize. By this point, the Roman army was barely responding. In many cases, Roman citizens in Britain, Spain, and Gaul realized the empire couldn't protect them anymore. They kicked out their Roman governors and made deals with the local barbarian warlords for protection. The Roman Empire didn't so much fall as it was replaced, piece by piece, with barbarian kingdoms. Now, here's the part of the story that historians used to ignore, but is now considered crucial: the environment. In recent years, scientists have analyzed ice cores from Greenland and tree rings from Europe. They've discovered that the history of Rome is written in the climate. Rome was lucky. Its rise happened during a period called the Roman climate optimum. It was warm, wet, and stable. Crops grew abundantly. But starting around 150 AD, the climate began to change. It got cooler and drier. This made farming harder, especially on the margins of the empire. Food shortages became common. Worse than the weather were the bugs. Rome's biggest enemy wasn't the Goths, it was germs. Because Rome was so interconnected, with massive trade routes linking Europe, Africa, and Asia, it also created a massive highway for disease. Think of it like the ancient version of globalization, where a virus could travel from Persia to Rome in a matter of months. Between 165 and 180 AD, the Roman world was hit by the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox. Brought back by soldiers fighting in the east, it killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people, roughly 10% of the population. Then, just as they were recovering, the plague of Cyprian hit in 250 AD. This was even worse. Bishop Cyprian described it as a horrific pestilence affecting the eyes, feet, and bowels. These plagues decimated the workforce. Fewer farmers meant less food. Less food meant higher prices. Higher prices meant less tax revenue. Less tax revenue meant a weaker army. Rome was fighting barbarians with one hand while fighting disease with the other, and it was losing both battles. Kyle Harper, a modern historian, argues that Rome was part of an ancient disease ecology. The empire essentially created the conditions for its own biological destruction by overcrowding cities and creating a germ pool. Finally, we have to touch on the cultural shift. This is the most controversial theory, famously pushed by historian Edward Gibbon in the 18th century. Gibbon argued that the rise of Christianity contributed to the fall. His logic was this: the old Roman religion was focused on civic duty, the state, and the emperor. It was outward-facing. Christianity, however, was focused on the afterlife, the soul, and a higher kingdom. Gibbon believed that this made Romans softer, less willing to fight for an earthly city when they were focused on the heavenly city. Furthermore, as the church grew, it took money and energy out of the state. Ambitious men who used to become senators or generals now became bishops. Energy that used to go into building roads and aqueducts went into building churches and debating theology. Most modern historians think Gibbon oversimplified things. The empire was already in deep trouble before Christianity became the official state religion in 380 AD. However, it is true that the empire became less tolerant and more fractured. Heresies and religious riots tore cities apart. The old Roman values of dignitas and gravitas, dignity and seriousness, were replaced by something else. The citizens of the late empire didn't really identify as Romans anymore. They identified as Christians, or as Gauls, or as Italians. When the barbarians came, they didn't see it as their empire falling. So, why did Rome fall? It wasn't one thing. It was a perfect storm. It was political instability, where the throne became a revolving door for corrupt and weak leaders. It was economic collapse, where a slave-dependent system choked on its own success and currency became worthless. It was military failure, where a once great army was replaced by disloyal mercenaries who couldn't hold the borders. It was the pressure of mass migration as the Huns pushed desperate tribes into Roman lands. It was environmental change, as the climate turned cold and plagues wiped out the population. And it was a cultural shift, where the old civic pride faded away and the glue that held society together dissolved. The Western Roman Empire didn't die in a blaze of glory. It faded away. One by one, the provinces stopped sending taxes. One by one, the cities shrank. The last emperor wasn't murdered by a mighty conqueror. He was a child sent into retirement by a low-level general. As Edward Gibbon famously wrote, the story of its ruin is simple and obvious, and instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it had subsisted so long. Rome fell because it grew too big, stayed too long, and faced too many problems at once. It teaches us that no empire is eternal. Power is fleeting. And the walls we build, whether of stone, money, or laws, are only as strong as the health of the society within them. When the lights went out in Europe, 1,000 years of darkness, the Middle Ages, began. But that, as they say, is a story for another video. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And I want to hear from you. In your opinion, what was the one thing that broke Rome? Was it the economic inflation, the barbarian invasions, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we have plenty more stories from the ancient world coming your way. Thanks for watching, and stay curious. Call to action, on-screen text end card. Subscribe for more history documentaries. Watch next, The Rise of the Byzantine Empire, How Rome Survived in the East. Comment, what modern country do you think faces challenges similar to Rome?